When we think of Ireland's enemies, our minds often wander to the British Empire, whose grip on Ireland endured for over 800 years, leaving scars of war, rebellion, and sorrow that still echo today. But Britain was not the first to set its sights on the island. Long before the Redcoats ever stepped ashore, a different force landed on Ireland's windswept coasts. They came in longships, carved like sea serpents, their sails black against the dawn. These were the Vikings, warriors of ice and fire from Scandinavia, and they were Ireland's first true foreign enemy. They didn't come to rule, they came to raid, burn, steal, and kill. Bigger, faster, and merciless, they struck terror into an island unprepared for such fury. But to understand how the Vikings changed Ireland forever, we must first return to a time where an untouched land, shaped only by its own people, its stone, its soil, and its gods. This is the story of ancient Ireland, and the first great clash between Ireland and a foreign power. Ireland was a land untouched by invasion. According to historians, around 8000 BC, as the Ice Age melted away, small bands of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from mainland Europe arrived by boat, surviving in dense forests, fishing wild rivers, and crafting flint-tipped tools. This is what archaeologists would call the first settlers of Ireland. Thousands of years later, a new wave came, the Neolithic farmers. They cleared land, raised livestock, and built fortified villages. They didn't just plant crops, they built tombs, massive stone monuments like Newgrange and Knowth, carved with spirals and symbols. They still guard Ireland's secrets. And then came the Celts, iron-wielding warriors who were obsessed with borders, carved the land into rival kingdoms. A fierce, tribal world of druids, raids, and cattle wars. But it was Christianity, arriving by the 5th century, that reshaped the island. Monasteries rose, literacy bloomed, and Ireland became a beacon of learning in Europe's dark age. This was Ireland, a land rich in culture and chaos, just before the first foreign enemy arrived. In the summer of 795 AD, Norse longships appeared, sleek, shallow vessels, carved with dragon prows. They moved fast and silent, perfect for navigating shallow waters and launching surprise attacks. That year, the first recorded Viking raid struck Ireland. A small monastery was burned to the ground, its monks slaughtered, its relics looted. No warning, no mercy, just fire, steel, and silence. This would not be an isolated act. The raiders, pagan Norsemen from Norway and Denmark, returned year after year. They targeted monasteries and churches, not just because of wealth, but because these were undefended and deeply symbolic. Ireland's monasteries were rich in gold, manuscripts, and sacred relics, and they were isolated. Easy prey. The keepers of Irish history were butchered or enslaved. Crosses were torn down, holy books were burnt, and bells were stolen to be melted into jewellery and weapons. The Viking strategy was ruthless, but effective. They struck from the sea with terrifying speed, raiding coastal settlements and retreating before local kings could respond. They came with axes, spears, and round shields, often wearing leather armour or chainmail. They captured slaves, women, monks, and children, to sell abroad. Over time, their raids grew bolder. They attacked deeper inland, following rivers into the heart of the island. The Shannon, the Boyne, and the Liffey became Viking highways of war. But by the mid-9th century, the Vikings were no longer content to raid. They came to stay. They established permanent bases, fortified camps called long forts, along Ireland's coasts. These grew into Ireland's first true towns: Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. From these hubs, they controlled trade routes, taxed local clans, and launched fresh inland attacks. Their long ports became centres of commerce: gold, silver, slaves, spices, and also power. Viking Ireland had become more than a series of warbands. It was now a kingdom. In Dublin, a Norse Gael named Sihtric Silkbeard rose to power. The son of Viking king and a Gaelic princess, was born both an invader and a native. He ruled Dublin as a Norse stronghold, with fleets at his command and alliances with Irish kings. Under his reign, Dublin became a thriving city, with churches, markets, and Viking law. But Sihtric's ambitions and the power of the Norse in Ireland would soon draw the wrath of a native Irish kings. But his claim would not go unchallenged. There was a man from the south who rose from the obscurity to challenge an empire of raiders. His name was Brian Boru, and he would become one of the most legendary figures in all of Irish history. Brian was born around 941 AD in Killaloe, County Clare. into the royal family of the Doyle-Gosh, a minor clan within the kingdom of Thomond, in what is now known as Munster. At the time, the Doyle-Gosh were seen as nobodies. The island was dominated by ancient dynasties like the Uí and powerful kings from Meath, Leinster and Ulster. But Brian's bloodline carried ambition and the trauma of war. His family had long fought the Norse Vikings of Limerick, who had brutalised the Shannon region for decades. But when Brian's father passed, Brian's older brother, Mark Vaughan, took up leadership and gradually expanded the Doyle-Gosh power, eventually becoming King of Munster. But in 976, Mark Vaughan was captured and murdered by Donabán mac Cahill, the king of Ganti. So Brian took the throne, and Brian swore vengeance. In a brutal campaign of war and retribution, Brian defeated the Norse of Limerick, sacked their strongholds, and shattered their power in the west. By 978, he had become King of Munster, and soon turned his eyes beyond. Brian was more than a warrior, he was a visionary. He rebuilt churches, patronised monasteries, and taxed trade routes. He forged alliances through marriages and negotiation, and expanded the Doyle-Gosh influence across the Shannon into Leinster and Connacht. But in the north, one man still held the title of High King of Ireland, Muilshig Niall II of the Uí dynasty. In 997, Brian and Muil agreed to divide Ireland in two, with Brian ruling the south and Muil the north. And for a time there was peace. Together they expelled the Norse from Dublin. But by 1002, Brian had grown too powerful. Muil was forced to submit, and Brian Boru claimed title of the Ard Rí, the High King of Ireland. For the first time in generations, Ireland had a king not from the north, but from the south, and from a previously insignificant clan. Brian wasn't just a warlord, he understood the value of image, faith, and infrastructure. He built roads, fortified rivers, repaired churches, and paid homage to Irish monasteries. He married multiple times, including the mother of Sitric Silkbeard, the Viking leader of Dublin, forming strategic bonds with former enemies. But not everyone accepted this rule. Old enemies steered, especially in Leinster and Dublin, where resentment against Brian's authority festered. The peace began to fracture. In 1013, rebellion erupted. King of Leinster and Brian's former ally broke ranks and joined forces with Sitric of Dublin. They summoned Viking mercenaries from the Isle of Man, the Hebrides and even Norway, seeking to break Brian's grip in Ireland. Brian, now well into his 70s, summoned the might of Munster, the warriors of Connacht, and the allies across Ireland. A final campaign led by a king who refused to die in peace. The final reckoning would come at Clontarf, just outside Dublin, on Good Friday, April the 23rd, 1014. Clontarf was then a flat, marshy plain along Dublin Bay, bordered by the River Tolka to the north and the Liffey to the south. The Viking fleet anchored nearby. At dawn, both sides assembled. An estimated 7,000 to 10,000 warriors. Brian's army stood in long shield walls. Irish nobles, Gaelic warriors, and mercenaries from southern clans. Opposite them stood Norse fighters in chainmail, axes, and round shields, backed by the Leinster forces and Viking allies from the other islands. The battle began at first light, with a furious melee across a muddy field. Murchad, the son of Brian, led charge after charge into Viking lines, breaking formations with raw Gaelic fury. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat. Axes split shields, swords shattered helms. Sigurd of Orkney fought bravely, carrying a sacred raven banner said to ensure victory, but he was eventually overwhelmed and killed in the chaos. Elsewhere, Brodir, the Norse commander from the Isle of Man, fought savagely, wielding a massive two-headed axe. But by afternoon, the tide had begun to turn in Brian's favour. The Vikings, pinned between the Irish army and the incoming sea tide, began to retreat towards their ships, only to find the tide had gone out. Their boats were now beached, and there was nowhere to run. Dozens drowned in the mudflats. Hundreds were cut down in retreat. The coalition collapsed. Victory belonged to Boru's forces, but it came at terrible costs. As the battle raged, Brian Boru remained behind in his tent, praying for peace and victory, but fate had other plans. As the enemy fled, Brodir and a small band of Vikings, in a final desperate act, circled around the battlefield. They found Brian's camp unguarded. There, they burst into the High King's tent and killed him, most likely with an axe, before being captured and executed by Irish warriors. Brian Boru, the unifier of Ireland, was dead. His son Muirked and grandson Budulvach had also fallen. The royal line was shattered. The Vikings of Dublin were defeated, their military power broken, but this was not the end of Ireland's troubles. With Brian dead and no clear heir, the island fell back into clan warfare. Still, Clontarf stood as a symbolic victory, not just over the Norse, but over centuries of division. Brian Boru became a legend, remembered not only as a king, but as a man who dared to unite a divided Ireland. The Norse threat had been crushed, but in the shadows, a new danger stirred across the sea. A rising power in England would soon set its sights on Ireland. The next invasion would not come from longships, but from the banners of the Normans.